stonework scorched by weapons that no longer exist, a pattern of polished footprints too regular to be accidental, the faint abrasion of gold on granite where a helmed figure once braced against some invisible weight. These are the traces left behind across the oldest precincts of the palace. Archivists catalogue the abrasion patterns, restorers note the impossibility of certain tool marks, and veterans of the palace guard still speak, in low tones, of corridors that seem to hold their breath when a sentinel passes. Where walls are older than the more recent wars, tapestries show figures rendered in impossible scale, their faces half obscured by crests and their hands holding weapons drawn with lines that suggest both art and ritual. These impressions persist in the material record, chips in ceremonial thresholds, polishing on banisters that matches the circular motion of a particular weapon, glyphic soot from power discharges that scorch the same ceiling beams across millennia. Objects left near those scars, boots, a scattering of melted gold leaf, a broken lens, are often logged anonymously and then sealed away for study, because the pattern they form resists easy classification and because the witnesses who might name them have long since been reassigned or entombed. After the site surveys, after the cataloguing and the cautious fireproofing, the pattern resolves into an identity. The guardians who leave those marks are the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's household guard in both purpose and provenance. They are the institution that stood between the throne and every real or imagined threat, a cadre whose presence has been recorded wherever the Emperor's will touched human affairs at its most intimate, and whose absence is felt as keenly as any breach in the palace's outer walls. Their emblem, nothing less than stylized vigilance set in gold, appears in fragments on doorframes and in the margins of private missives that survived the purges and the reorganizations of the palace bureaucracy. The Adeptus Custodes are not merely guards in the conventional sense. Their origin, their composition, and their mission place them beyond the usual categories applied to the Imperial Armed Forces, and their imprint on architecture, ritual, and administrative practice demonstrates a continuity of purpose that predates many of the institutions that now share the Imperium's command structures. The earliest sources that touch on their beginnings place the first of these warriors at the centre of the Emperor's own project to unify Terra and prepare humanity for its expansion into the stars. They are consistently described as appearing during the Terran unification wars and then persisting through the Great Crusade and into the conflict that followed. Where Space Marines are the product of gene seed propagated across legions, the Adeptus Custodes are depicted in primary summaries and codified entries as singular creations. Each body is the result of bespoke augmentation and ritual, shaped to be an individual masterpiece rather than one member of an industrially produced brotherhood. This distinction appears repeatedly in canonical and semi-canonical accounts, and explains in part why the Custodians were never a mass force. The Emperor's attention to individual excellence meant that their numbers were necessarily constrained, and their training and modification processes were correspondingly exacting. By design, then, they were conceived to be the perfect shield and the perfectly discrete instrument of the Imperial will, occupying a role that combined bodyguard duties with technical and advisory functions that were only occasionally public. The purpose behind that design is evident when the Custodians' functions are observed in practice. They operated as the Emperor's intimate protectors, as custodians of secrets, and as the final arbiter of who might cross certain thresholds. For the Emperor, they were both a defensive presence and an extension of sovereign authority. They were entrusted with access to restricted archives, to the mechanisms that sustained the highest offices of the realm, and to doors that remain closed to most of the Imperium even now. Their stewardship of the Golden Throne and the immediate precincts of the Imperial seat is the defining duty in the surviving administrative records, and it explains why, after the Emperor's internment, the Custodians adopted an even more circumscribed posture. Where once they joined campaigns beyond Terra in the company of the Great Crusade, subsequent centuries show them concentrating their power within the heart of the Imperium and delegating operational authority outward in ways that preserved their responsibility for palace security. This role, as much administrative as martial, gave them access to classified intelligence and institutional influence that outstripped the raw numbers any other force could bring. Biologically, the Adeptus Custodes are consistently represented in the available sources as materially distinct from ordinary humans and distinct, as a rule, from the Space Marines as well. Measurements provided in descriptive entries and bestiary treatments place an average Custodian at close to 9 Terran feet in height when unhelmed, a stature that overshadows ordinary warriors and even many of the larger transhumans created for war. This statured presence is often emphasized as part of their psychological effect in public ceremony, as well as in combat. Writers and codices describe their muscles, bones, and tissues as altered to an extraordinary degree. Bone density increased, reflex arcs accelerated, and sensory acuity enhanced to allow faster than normal threat assessment. Where specific figures for mass or metabolic rate are absent from the primary codices, commentators have inferred, on biomechanical grounds, that their mass would be multiple times that of an unaugmented human of comparable height. Such estimates remain unofficial and vary among sources. The most reliable contemporary descriptions therefore remain qualitative. The Custodians are far more superior in strength, speed, and resiliency compared to the standard or bionically enhanced humans and even the Adeptus Astartes. They are depicted as capable of sustained combat performance that would exhaust or terminate a non-augmented or mechanically and biologically enhanced units within the Imperium. Those physiological attributes are inseparable from the methods by which recruits were chosen and transformed. Early records and the surviving narrative fragments indicate that recruitment was highly selective and that candidates were often drawn from particular social strata on Terra. Entries referring to the offspring of noble houses and to individuals raised in environments of both privilege and hardship recur in multiple accounts. Selection criteria emphasized both physical potential and psychological suitability. Where the gene seed approach allowed the legions of Space Marines to expand around template genotypes, the Custodians' process required the Emperor's direct intervention and the application of techniques now described only in oblique terms: arcane surgeries, biochemical regimens, augmented conditioning, and a suite of psycho-educational imprints intended to bind a warrior's habits to a single overarching loyalty. This hermetic, labour-intensive process, combined with the need to preserve uniqueness in each subject, meant that the Custodians were always few. Contemporary historiography thus characterises them as elite exemplars rather than the backbone of any mass field army. Their training and doctrine follow logically from that selection. A Custodian is educated to act with independent judgment and to operate as a complete fighting unit in a single body. Tactical instruction stresses anticipatory analysis. A Custodian is trained to read a battlefield in the sliver of time before violence unfolds and to preempt hostile intent through precision action. This emphasis on anticipatory decision-making produces a martial philosophy that privileges surgical engagement and decisive placement over attritional warfare. In practice, that means the Custodians function as a defensive bulwark for the palace and as a mobile surgical force when tasks demand intervention beyond static guard duty. They combine ceremonial duties, standing as the living conduits of the Emperor's dignity, with the ability to execute operations that elsewhere in the Imperium would require entire formations. Their doctrine therefore fuses sovereignty, secrecy, and lethality in a single, unyielding professional ethic. Material culture embodies that ethic. The image often associated with these guardians is of Baroque golden armour that is at once ceremonial and functionally superior. The armours are not standardised in the sense that a legionary's suit might be. Rather, they are described in source notes as bespoke artefacts, each a work of art as much as a technological system. Worn with guardian spears, sentinel blades, and other signature weapons, the armour serves both to display and to concentrate the Guardian's capacities. The Guardian spear in particular recurs in historical and equipment entries as the archetypal armament, a halberd-like haft integrating a close combat blade with a ranged firing system, designed to be wielded in sweeping arcs that combine reach and firing power in a single gesture. More specialised patterns of armour and gear appear in other records. Units that adopt Terminator pattern, defensive shells for heavy assault purposes, riders who employ swift, jet-propelled vehicles for rapid response, and discrete detachments trained for the elimination of high-value targets. Those variations underline a central point. The Custodian's equipment is as much an expression of individual capability as it is a tool for collective action. The leadership structure that grew up around this institution balanced singular authority with collegial command. Historical narratives identify key figures around whom the early custodial order aggregated. Among these, Constantine Valdor is repeatedly named as a primary exemplar, a commander of such presence and skill that he functions in legend and record as the first among the 10,000, a title that reflects both numerical mythos and ceremonial weight. Valdor's career, as recorded in multiple summaries and focused articles, places him at the Emperor's side through the Unification Wars, across the Great Crusade, and into the convulsions that led to the great civil conflict that followed. His command is represented as the institutional anchor that allowed the Custodians to transition from a roaming Praetorian force that accompanied the Emperor into the wider theatre of conquest to a palace-centred power with responsibilities that fused martial, ceremonial and custodial administrative functions. The narrative of his tenure shows how leadership among the Custodians combined personal martial excellence with an administrative role that required oversight of the palace's defence machinery and the education of successive generations. That concentration of power and access shaped the Custodians' relationship to other imperial institutions. They have been recorded as holding authority to control access to the Emperor's inner spaces in ways that even Space Marine commanders find difficult to contest. Their remit included the policing of the throne room, the maintenance of sensitive artifacts, and the management of the immediate defences that surround the seat of empire. Those responsibilities made the Custodians, in administrative terms, simultaneously military guardians and the stewards of protocol. In situations where their martial duties required action beyond the palace, they were sometimes found integrated into broader campaigns or called upon to act as specialists attached to larger forces. Yet the institutional tendency, particularly after the Emperor's internment, was toward containment. The Custodians increasingly framed their doctrine around the defence of the palace and the Golden Throne, leaving the broader tasks of projection and conquest to the legions, the navies, and the other organs of imperial rule. Sources touch often on the paradox inherent to their existence. The Custodians are at once the most humanly intimate of the Emperor's instruments and the most removed from ordinary human experience. Their uniqueness is enforced by ritual and by the architecture of secrecy that surrounds them. Their armour and weaponry are catalogued in restricted registries. Their recruit lists are, where they survive, subject to greater degrees of redaction than the records of greater and more populous formations. Even where historians and archivists have access to fragmentary dossiers, the picture that emerges is one of a force designed to embody a specific relationship between person and power, crafted by the sovereign, entrusted with the most dangerous knowledge, and disciplined into a professional identity that transcends the norms of rank-and-file military culture. This professional identity is evident in their field practices and in the continuing aura that surrounds their presence in ceremony and in war. The surviving material evidence, the impressions in stone and the abrasion of gilded banisters, therefore represent more than the passage of bodies through halls. They are the residue of a deliberate project of guardianship, a physical sermon on the relationship between authority and protection. When the Custodians moved beyond the palace, as they did in the earlier centuries of expansion, their marks become battlefield artifacts, shattered spears, folded banners pierced by guardian blades, and reports of single figures turning the tide of engagements. When they remain at home, the traces are quieter, footprints on marble that are worn into grooves, the soft polish of the same hand that has closed and opened the same seal across generations. Between those two registers, field and palace, the Adeptus Custodes have placed themselves as an enduring but exceptional instrument of imperial continuity. The current archival task is to interpret those traces without mythologizing them, to extract administrative and tactical lessons from the marks the Custodians leave, and to record plainly the role they have played in the broader story of the Imperium's governance. This account deliberately confines itself to what can be established from the surviving records and the most commonly cited secondary descriptions. It avoids speculation about metaphysical origins beyond noting that their creation involved technologies and rituals not widely disclosed, and that their exceptional status arises from a combination of bespoke augmentation, extreme selectivity, and an institutional purpose that fused martial, advisory, and custodial duties. Subsequent parts will expand into the Custodians' material culture, into detailed descriptions of their armour and weapon systems, and into the documented instances in which they left the palace to intervene in the affairs of the Imperium at large. For now, the imprint remains the primary evidence: gold scored into stone, signs of ceremonial passage, and a pattern of access and protection that marks the Adeptus Custodes as singular among the Imperium's many armed orders. The technological style of the Adeptus Custodes is marked by a paradox. Their panoply appears ceremonial and archaic in its visual language, yet it consistently demonstrates functional superiority over nearly every other wargear standard across the Imperium. Their equipment is described as singularly ornate, often sheathed in gold, bearing filigree and iconography that signal their status as guardians of the Emperor. To the casual observer, the Baroque engravings and elaborate crests suggest a display piece rather than a field instrument, but in fact every line of their armour, every curve of their blades, and every inlaid power conductor is both aesthetic and practical. Their technological idiom is one of deliberate uniqueness. Unlike the mass-produced wargear issued to the Astra Militarum or even the standardized variations of armour among the Adeptus Astartes, each Custodian's arms and armour are said to be unique to the individual warrior. This approach reflects their status as singular creations rather than interchangeable soldiers. The armour most closely associated with the Custodians is their auramite battleplate. Auramite is described as one of the most resilient materials known to the Imperium, resistant not only to conventional weapons but also to many forms of psychic attack. In the records that survive, the substance is said to exceed even ceramite in protective qualities, while being lighter and more responsive to the wearer's movements. This allows the Custodian to combine near absolute defense with speed, a synthesis rarely achieved by other forms of power armor. The design is never entirely uniform. Each suit is tailored to its bearer, with fittings and adaptive responses aligned to their physiology and combat style. This produces not only an impressive battlefield effect, but also reinforces the individuality of each Custodian. Where the Space Marine battle brother can expect to don an armour whose lineage ties back to his chapter and its artificers, the Custodian bears a suit that is essentially an extension of his body and identity, inseparable from his operational capacity. Weapons too exhibit this dual quality of ornament and lethality. The Guardian Spear is the most emblematic of these. At first sight a ceremonial halberd, its haft conceals a compact bolt-firing mechanism, enabling the wielder to engage at both melee and ranged intervals. The design reflects a preference for versatility and a belief that a single Custodian should be capable of meeting any threat without requiring reinforcement. Other arms, such as the Sentinel Blade, the Misericordia Dagger, or the Pyrrhithite Spear, represent variations of this same principle, weapons engineered to combine symbolic weight with practical lethality. The Misericordia, for instance, is more than a sidearm. It is traditionally carried by all Custodians as a marker of their role as executioner if necessary, a silent reminder that their loyalty to the Emperor grants them authority to enact judgment without hesitation. Specialized tools and relics are occasionally referenced in battlefield accounts. Some detachments carry storm shields of auramite, creating near-impermeable bulwarks when deployed in formation. Other units employ weapons that integrate advanced energy projection systems such as the Adrathic Destructors, devices believed to operate on principles largely lost to contemporary Mechanicus understanding. Their rarity underlines the point that the Custodians wield technologies that are at once familiar and opaque. The designs are sanctioned by their own artificers, perfected through traditions preserved within the palace, and remain deliberately withheld from mass replication. This withholding is not merely due to secrecy, but also to the principle that the Custodians are to remain distinct, not diluted by wider adoption of their methods. Vehicles extend this technological philosophy into mobility and heavy assault. The Custodians deploy jet bikes known as Dawn Eagles, whose origins trace back to the earliest days of the Imperium when such technologies were more widely available. These machines combine elegance of form with devastating combat capacity. A Custodian mounted on one can traverse terrain with extreme speed while projecting destructive firepower. In rare instances, heavy grav-tanks and transports such as the Caladius Grav-Tank or the Coronis Grav-Carrier are referenced. These vehicles combine high maneuverability with formidable armament and are said to exceed most Imperial equivalents in speed, armor resilience, and weapon integration. Their production appears extremely limited, confined to specialized forges within the palace, and their deployment is correspondingly rare, reserved for operations of greatest significance. Unlike the massed armoured columns of the Astra Militarum, the Custodians' vehicles are never fielded in great number. They're extensions of the elite ethos, precision tools rather than instruments of attrition. The social structure of the Adeptus Custodes is as singular as their war gear. They do not adhere to the codified ranks that typify most military organizations. Instead, authority within their order emerges through seniority, experience, and demonstrated excellence. All Custodians are expected to act with a degree of independence, capable of reading situations and executing action without waiting for collective orders. This reflects their origin as handcrafted guardians, each imbued with sufficient judgment to act as a complete instrument of imperial will. Within this system, certain offices and honours exist. The Captain-General functions as the supreme commander of the Adeptus Custodes, both in ceremonial representation and in operational command. This role has been historically occupied by figures of immense reputation, with Constantine Valdor remembered as the archetype. Beneath the Captain-General, shield captains serve as leaders of contingents, not by formalized rank, but by recognition of capability and by tradition. Supporting this command structure are specialized cadres such as the Hetairon Guard, the most trusted body within the 10,000, who act as both honor guard and strategic executors. The role of tribune, functioning as high-ranking officials within their own sphere, indicates the blend of martial and administrative responsibilities borne by the Custodians. Even the most junior Custodian is nevertheless an extraordinary warrior whose position carries weight equal to or greater than most commanders of other Imperial forces. This lack of rigid rank fosters an environment in which initiative and adaptability are paramount. It also reinforces their social identity as unique individuals, bound together by loyalty to the Emperor rather than by standardized chain of command. Values underpinning this structure are consistently described in sources as absolute loyalty to the Emperor, an ethos of vigilance, and a cultivated detachment from wider Imperial society. The Custodians are sworn first and foremost to their role as protectors of the Emperor's person and throne. This loyalty is not abstract but lived. Their lives are defined entirely by service, without allowance for private ambitions or social roles beyond the order. This creates a value system that elevates honour, duty, and readiness above all else. The ritual of carrying the misericordia, the strictures surrounding their armour and weaponry, and the solemnity of their ceremonies all reflect this underlying ethos. They are guardians not merely of the Emperor's body, but of the very concept of his sovereignty. Civilian and military roles within their society merge rather than diverge. Unlike the Space Marines, who are often described as monastic warriors embedded within chapter culture, the Custodians have no separation between civilian and military life. Every Custodian is a warrior, and every aspect of his existence is directed toward that identity. Their community within the palace functions as both barracks and society, with roles such as artificer, archivist, or advisor, all being carried out by Custodians themselves rather than by an external civilian support structure. In this way, their order operates as a self-sustaining elite society, closed to outsiders, where every role ultimately serves the central mission of protection. Their ceremonies, their maintenance of arms, their study of tactics, and their interactions with other Imperial officials are all undertaken in the same spirit of service. This closed structure ensures both secrecy and cohesion. The Adeptus Custodes are not seen in the marketplaces of terror, nor do they participate in the broader ecclesiastical or civilian life of the Imperium. Their duties confine them to the palace, to ritual presences at Imperial ceremonies, and to rare deployments beyond. Internally, their society maintains continuity through traditions of instruction, mentorship, and constant vigilance. Theirs is a culture of perpetual readiness, where even in periods of apparent stillness, training, observation, and refinement of skills occupy every waking moment. They embody the principle that their very existence is their role. There is no civilian custodian, no retirement, no separate life beyond service. Thus, their technology, gear, tools, and vehicles form a material reflection of their ethos, while their social structure and values express the psychological and cultural foundation of that same ethos. Their civilian and military roles are indistinguishable, each custodian being a singular embodiment of both warrior and servant. The Adeptus Custodes remain a society apart, defined entirely by their devotion to the Emperor and to the guardianship of his throne, wielding technologies and values carefully preserved to reinforce their uniqueness across millennia. The history of the Adeptus Custodes is illuminated not only by the order itself, but also by the figures who embodied its ideals and the units and war machines that extended their capacity beyond the walls of the Imperial Palace. At the apex of their leadership stands the Captain-General, a title more enduring than any one bearer yet indelibly associated with Constantine Valdor. In the earliest records of the Great Crusade and the unification wars that preceded it, Valdor emerges as one of the most trusted confidants of the Emperor. His leadership was defined not only by martial brilliance, but by an ability to interpret the will of the Emperor into direct action, whether that meant overseeing the Custodians' role in securing terror or commanding them on campaigns beyond. Valdor's reputation has endured across millennia, shaping the office itself into something more than a command role. Later, holders of the position inherit not only authority, but the weight of comparison to a near-mythical predecessor. The Captain-General is simultaneously warlord, administrator, and the visible face of an otherwise withdrawn order. Other leaders appear in the historical record in less detail, often obscured by the secrecy surrounding the Custodians. Tribunes, who are recorded as high-ranking custodians with authority approaching that of the Captain-General in their assigned spheres, carry immense weight within the order. Shield captains, though technically subordinate, command detachments that operate with independence, rivaling entire chapters of Space Marines. Within the Heteron Guard, leadership is more symbolic than hierarchical, as their role is less about commanding and more about being exemplars of loyalty and skill. They form the personal companions of the Emperor, a position that transcends conventional military rank. These leaders collectively reflect a model of governance built on recognition of capability rather than rigid stratification. Among units, the 10,000 are remembered not as a faceless collective but as a society of unique individuals grouped into specialized cadres. The Heteron Guard remain the most famous, their proximity to the Emperor making them both his protectors and his instruments of personal intervention. Alongside them, the Aquilon Terminators represent the Custodians' answer to heavy assault warfare. Encased in Alarus pattern Terminator plate, they combine the durability of Auramite with the flexibility to operate independently or in concert, each member trained to act as a self-sufficient operative. The Venatari Custodians, equipped with flight packs and specialized weaponry, represent an evolution toward extreme mobility, able to close with enemies or hold critical positions inaccessible to heavier formations. Each unit type reflects not a mass production doctrine, but an artisanal solution to specific operational demands, created with the understanding that every custodian must be capable of fulfilling the most critical roles with minimal support. War machines expand this principle on a larger scale. The Telemann Heavy Dreadnought is perhaps the most striking example. Unlike the more common Space Marine dreadnoughts, which inter the mortally wounded, the Telemon is said to house only the most revered of custodians, warriors whose service is deemed too vital to allow final rest. The technology sustaining these constructs is ancient and opaque, with some sources suggesting the methods of preservation are little understood even by the Mechanicus. The Telemon's presence on the battlefield embodies not only destructive power, but the idea that the Custodians do not lightly relinquish their finest. Other machines, such as the Caladius Grav-Tank or Coronis Grav Carrier, have already been noted for their speed and firepower, but their rarity and singular craftsmanship elevate them from vehicle to artifact. Each such war machine functions less as a standard unit of war and more as a statement. The Custodians will only commit such assets in moments of highest consequence. Behavioral instincts among the Custodians distinguish them from other Imperial elites. Where the Adeptus Astartes are shaped by gene seed into a form of warrior monastic detachment and ritualized aggression, the Custodians embody vigilance and adaptability. They are trained from inception to evaluate and respond rather than to act by rote. Their instincts lean toward patience, observation, and calculated response, mirroring their eternal role as guardians of the Emperor. Yet when action is required, their responses are immediate and absolute, displaying efficiency rather than excess. This balance between restraint and decisiveness defines their operational philosophy. Unlike the frenzied zeal of the Black Templars or the cold logic of the Iron Hands, the Custodians manifest an instinctive equilibrium. They neither underestimate nor hesitate, but commit in precisely the measure required. This mindset is reinforced through rituals that serve not as displays for the masses, but as internal affirmations of loyalty and identity. The carrying of the Misericordia dagger remains among the most significant. Though rarely used in battle, it symbolizes their readiness to execute judgment in the Emperor's name, even against one of their own if duty demands it. Their ceremonies are known to include oaths of service renewed in the shadow of the Golden Throne, and observances in which war gear is consecrated as both tool and symbol. These rituals are conducted with solemnity but without ostentation, intended not to inspire others but to reinforce the Custodian's own understanding of their role. They are rituals of continuity, linking each Custodian to the Order's origins and to the Emperor directly, bypassing the need for broader religious intermediaries such as the ecclesiarchy. Ethics within the Adeptus Custodes are defined by absolutes rather than relative codes. Their loyalty to the Emperor is unconditioned and absolute. Their duty to guard him supersedes all other considerations. This often places them at odds with other imperial institutions, where the Inquisition may demand access, or the High Lords may seek to direct imperial policy. The Custodians act according to their singular mission, permitting no compromise that might endanger the Emperor. This ethical clarity translates into action. They may intervene decisively against even the most powerful factions of the Imperium if such intervention is judged necessary. Their authority to do so derives not from edicts, but from the fundamental principle of their existence as the Emperor's personal guardians. Internally, their society is marked by subtle divisions, though never in ways that compromise unity. One may speak of castes not as rigid classes, but as functional identities within the Order. The Heteran Guard form one such division, their status elevating them into a distinct echelon of trust. Tribunes and shield captains occupy another, recognized for their leadership capacities. Units such as the Aquilon or Venatari establish further specialization. Yet these distinctions do not form a hierarchy of privilege so much as an organization of responsibility. Each Custodian remains fundamentally equal in his core identity as a guardian. Even the most honored among them is still bound by the same oaths, the same devotion, and the same vigilance. The absence of rigid hierarchy reinforces their cohesion, preventing internal divisions from becoming vulnerabilities. In their entirety, the Adeptus Custodes can thus be seen as a culture of unique individuals bound into a singular mission, led by figures of mythic reputation, fielding units and machines that are as much artifacts as they are military assets. Their behavioural instincts ensure that they remain watchful yet decisive. Their rituals and ethics sustain their clarity of purpose, and their internal divisions distribute responsibility without eroding unity. They are at once a society and an army, but above all they are the embodiment of the Emperor's will to guard his throne, unchanged across the passing of millennia. The archives of the Adeptus Terra are filled with references to the Emperor's companions, though many of these are obscured by deliberate censorship, the decay of millennia, or the simple unwillingness of imperial scribes to set in ink what may not be questioned. When viewed through the eyes of the Adeptus Administratum, the Adeptus Custodes are not simply warriors, they're a permanent reminder of authority above even the High Lords themselves. Their presence in any matter, whether civil or martial, transforms the calculations of administrators and clerks who otherwise believe themselves to be arbiters of imperial order. Where most divisions of the Imperium are defined by laws, ranks, and codified procedures, the Custodes stand outside of this structure. For the Administratum, this represents both a stabilizing certainty and a dangerous anomaly. Stability arises because their loyalty is to the Emperor alone, and that loyalty is absolute. Danger arises because no quill pusher, no logister, and no Lord Commander of the Segmentum can claim oversight over them. The Adeptus Mechanicus, on the other hand, approaches the Custodians with an entirely different lens. The Mechanicum of Mars has always been simultaneously awed and frustrated by the Emperor's companions. The reason is clear. The technology within the gene seed, war gear, and armaments of the Custodes does not conform to the standardized patterns of the Mechanicus, nor is it reproducible by the strict dogmas of the cult Mechanicus. Auramite, the gleaming metal from which their armour is forged, is of such rare and difficult origin that its proper refinement is scarcely understood, even by the highest-ranking Magi Metallurgicus. The Guardian spears, carrying both master-crafted blades and built-in bolter weaponry, are singular relics, each a masterpiece of biomechanical and material engineering. In the logic engines of Mars, this represents a category of technology that cannot be catalogued, imitated, or sanctified through litany. It can only be respected and, in some sense, envied. Between these two perspectives, the Administratum's fear of political imbalance and the Mechanicus' awe of technical mystery, lies the uneasy triangle of power and perception that defines the Custodes' broader role in imperial governance. From the earliest days of the Great Crusade, it is recorded that the Emperor forbade the Mechanicum from prying too deeply into the secrets of the Custodians' creation. Fabricator General Kelba Hal himself is noted to have once remarked, before his eventual betrayal to the War Master, that the Emperor's personal guard represented an order of artificing beyond the reach of Mars. This statement, carefully preserved in sealed Mechanicus canticles, continues to echo through their politics even 10,000 years later. The Custodians are not servants of the machine god, nor are they dependent upon Mechanicus forges. Their war gear is maintained within the vaults of Terra itself, by artisans and techno-mystics who owe allegiance only to the Emperor's throne. For the Mechanicus, this separation is intolerable in theory, but inescapable in practice. The Administratum has faced similar paradoxes. To govern an empire of 1,000,000 worlds requires order, predictability, and hierarchy, yet the Custodes, whose interventions are sporadic and unaccountable, represent precisely the kind of irregular influence that defies all scheduling and tabulation. A Custodian's arrival in any sector, meeting, tribunal, or compliance council halts discussion. Decisions are revised instantly. Administrators have been known to burn documents, alter reports, or abandon long-prepared arguments simply because a silent Auramite figure has entered the chamber. The Custodian need not speak. His presence is the Emperor's presence. The political ramifications are immense. In truth, most Administratum scribes dread the Custodes not because they believe the warriors will bring physical harm, but because their involvement renders months or years of careful administrative maneuvering irrelevant. Nevertheless, both the Administratum and the Mechanicus recognize the Custodes as necessary to imperial survival. The Administratum sees them as the ultimate deterrent against treachery at the highest levels. High Lords may conspire, Navis Nobilitae houses may jockey for position, and the ecclesiarchy may swell in influence, but the Custodes remain untouchable and unimpeachable. Their word when given is a final verdict. Even the Senatorum Imperialis bends beneath it. To challenge their authority would be to challenge the Emperor himself, a move that no scribe or lord would survive. For the Mechanicus, the Custodes embody proof that the Emperor's genius outstrips even their deepest vaults of knowledge. The Emperor may be interpreted as the Omnissiah, yet the Custodes remind the Magi that they are not privy to all the Omnissiah's mysteries. This creates a hierarchy not of law, but of reverence. The political interplay between these three pillars, Administratum, Mechanicus, and Custodes, has been evident across the millennia. For example, during the Age of Apostasy in the 36th millennium, when Gog Vandir seized control of both the ecclesiarchy and the Administratum, it was the Custodes who ended his reign. Their intervention was not bureaucratic but absolute. Administratum records state simply that the Custodians entered Vandir's palace, bypassed his Frateris Templar bodyguards, and forced an end to his tyranny. For the Administratum, this was both a liberation and a humiliation. Liberation because Vandir's excesses had nearly destroyed the Imperium's unity. Humiliation because it revealed that all the Administratum's offices, armies and scribes could not restrain a single man intoxicated by power. Only the Custodes could. The episode reinforced their perception of the Custodians as arbiters of last resort, beyond politics, beyond procedure, and therefore fundamentally unpredictable. The Mechanicus, for its part, has long viewed such interventions with fascination. The sheer endurance of Custodian war gear, maintained for millennia without standard Mechanicus oversight, is seen as miraculous. When a Custodian marches into battle wearing armour that predates entire Forge worlds, still gleaming and functional, the Mechanicus interprets it as sacred proof of a hidden union between flesh and machine. This has led to complex negotiations over the ages, as fabricators general have repeatedly petitioned to study, replicate, or at least sanctify Custodian armaments. Every petition has been denied. The refusal is not born of hostility but of principle. The Custodes' technology is the Emperor's own design, entrusted only to his artisans within the Imperial Palace. For the Mechanicus, this denial is both infuriating and invigorating, sparking new waves of innovation as they attempt in vain to match what they are forbidden to touch. This relationship of awe, suspicion, and politics has practical consequences. The Administratum often invokes the Custodes as a final authority when adjudicating disputes between planetary governors or sector commands. The phrase, "by Custodian decree," appears rarely in records, but when it does, it carries a finality greater than any seal of terror. Similarly, the Mechanicus has learned to frame its more controversial projects in terms that avoid provoking Custodian intervention. When research borders on forbidden archaeotech, the Magi must tread carefully, for Custodian silence is not approval. It is a watchful patience that may end without warning. Politics across the Imperium therefore bends around the Custodes in ways subtle and overt. Administratum scribes may whisper about their fear of Auramite shadows in the halls of power, while Magi of Mars debate whether the Emperor deliberately withheld knowledge of Custodian technology to preserve the balance of power. Agreements between Terra and Mars often bear Custodian signatures, not as negotiators, but as guarantors. Their role is less that of participants, and more that of guardians ensuring compliance with the Emperor's will. From these impressions arises a truth both the Administratum and Mechanicus acknowledge, even if reluctantly. The Adeptus Custodes are not a faction within the Imperium. They are the Imperium's foundation embodied in flesh and gold. Where the Administratum writes its laws and the Mechanicus forges its machines, the Custodes enforce the permanence of the Emperor's design. Their politics are not politics at all. They are reminders that there is an authority no quill can record and no cogitator can replicate. It is the weight of the Emperor's hand extended through his companions that keeps the Imperium from collapsing under its own contradictions. The history of the Adeptus Custodes is not measured in campaigns like that of the Astra Militarum or in crusades like the Adeptus Astartes. Their record is scattered, often deliberately obscured, and rarely enumerated by the administratum or the mechanicus. When custodians march to war, it is never as part of an ongoing theatre of conflict requiring sustained occupation or the capture of territory. Instead, their interventions occur at moments when the survival of the Imperium itself is in question, or when the sanctity of the Emperor's person or his palace is directly threatened. These events, though comparatively rare, leave impressions so deep that even the most hardened scribes of the administratum cannot erase them, and the Mechanicus preserves them in reverent canticles as instances of unmatched martial perfection. One of the most significant examples remains the siege of the Imperial Palace during the Horus Heresy. While the legions Astartes fought across the walls and bastions of terror, the Custodes stood in defence of the Sanctum Imperialis itself. Accounts from that era, fragmented and often contradicted, nevertheless agree on a few constants. The Custodians did not waver, did not break ranks, and did not require reinforcement even under the heaviest assaults by traitor space marines, demons, and corrupted war engines. Their golden armour became synonymous with unyielding defiance. Administratum records describe them as pillars of auramite amidst a tide of black and red. Though the Astartes of the Imperial Fists and Blood Angels held the outer walls, and the Sisters of Silence lent their psychic null aura within the inner sanctums, it was the Custodes who were seen as the final barrier between the War Master's forces and the Emperor's presence on Terra. Their fighting style during this siege, as reconstructed by Mechanicus war scholars, reveals much about their approach to battle. Unlike the Astartes, who favour shock assault and momentum, the Custodians fought with measured precision. Every strike was calculated to kill, every movement aligned with defensive cohesion. Their guardian spears allowed seamless transition between ranged and melee combat, maintaining efficiency in close quarters while never sacrificing ranged lethality. Shield-bearing Custodians, equipped with Presidium shields and sentinel blades, anchored defensive formations that absorbed the heaviest charges of traitor legions. In comparison to the vast, grinding attrition faced by the Imperial army on other fronts, Custodian combat doctrine resembled the movements of a duelist scaled up to war, economical, deliberate, and devastating. After the heresy, the Custodes largely withdrew from open battlefields, focusing instead on the defense of Terra and the stewardship of the Emperor's golden throne. Yet exceptions punctuate this long vigil. In the 32nd millennium, records indicate a Custodian intervention on Tharis, where a splinter of the Orc race had managed to breach into the Sol system's outskirts. While the Imperial Navy struggled to contain the incursion, a contingent of Custodians deployed to the orbital stations. Their arrival turned what had been a slow retreat into immediate victory. Witness accounts describe Custodians boarding Orc hulks directly, cutting through greenskin warbosses and meganobs with such efficiency that even hardened naval officers regarded the battle as bordering on the miraculous. The administratum reduced the event to a terse report, stating only that Orc threat neutralized, Sol integrity maintained. The Mechanicus, however, studied Orc wreckage that bore evidence of Custodian weapons, clean dissection of armor plating, utterly precise wounds, and concluded that no other force in the Imperium could have delivered such surgical annihilation. Another defining conflict occurred during the Age of Apostasy, when the Custodes once more stepped beyond the walls of terror. The assassination of Gog Van Dyer, Ecclesiarch and High Lord, is perhaps the most politically loaded action ever taken by the Companions. While not a war in the conventional sense, it was a battle nonetheless, fought within the ecclesiarchal palace where Vandir's Frateris Templar defended their master to the death. The Custodians, accompanied by the newly reformed brides of the Emperor, later known as the Sisters of Battle, forced their way through layers of zealots and fanatics. Administratum reports describe this as a surgical strike that decapitated a regime threatening to tear the Imperium apart. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, this intervention reaffirmed that the Custodians acted as final arbiters of balance within Imperial power. Their battle conduct was notable for restraint. They sought no conquest, only the removal of one man whose corruption endangered the throne. In more recent centuries, the Custodes have been sighted on Prospero during the infamous burning of the Thousand Suns homeworld. Although the main assault was carried out by the Space Wolves, fragments of Mechanicus datalumes suggest that Custodians were present alongside the Sisters of Silence, entering the city of Tizca to enforce the Emperor's direct decree. Their role was not to fight the Space Wolves' war, but to secure compliance with the Edicts of Nicaea and ensure the psychic sorcery of the Thousand Suns could not spill unchecked into the Materium. Accounts emphasize their refusal to yield to the warp-fueled mutations of Magnus's Legion, cutting down rubric marines and sorcerous constructs with equal precision. For Administratum scribes, this was evidence of the Emperor's hand guiding his companions to enforce not only military but also legal decrees across the galaxy. When considering fighting style across these disparate engagements, patterns emerge. Custodians favour small unit deployments, never fielding massed companies or legions like the Astartes. Their combat is characterised by overwhelming superiority at the point of contact rather than attrition across a front. Administratum observers frequently note the apparent imbalance between their numbers and their effect. A handful of Custodians can alter the course of a planetary engagement that would otherwise require regiments of the Astra Militarum. The Mechanicus interprets this through the lens of efficiency, describing the Custodes as the minimum expression of absolute force. Their weapons and armour function as extensions of their gene-forged physiology, producing a seamless warrior-machine integration that even the most advanced Skitarii cannot match. Battle details preserved in Mechanicus archives also describe their psychological impact. Enemy combatants, whether traitor Astartes, heretics, or Xenos, often break morale at the mere sight of Auramite. Administratum records use the phrase shock of divinity, indicating that foes interpret the Custodes not as men but as avatars of divine authority. This intimidation effect, combined with their combat skill, produces outcomes disproportionate to their numbers. In practical terms, they do not simply kill enemies, they dismantle entire morale structures. Orc warbands that would otherwise fight to the last suddenly scatter. Chaos cultists who believe themselves fearless collapse into disarray. Even Astartes, engineered for fearlessness, approach Custodians with hesitation. Recent wars further highlight this role. During the 13th Black Crusade, when Abaddon's forces poured into the Cadian Gate, the Custodes were deployed for the first time in millennia beyond Terra in significant numbers. Their golden presence on Cadia itself, alongside Imperial Guard and Astartes, demonstrated that the Imperium had reached a threshold where only the Emperor's personal guardians could preserve order. Administratum reports emphasized the symbolic as much as the tactical. The sight of Custodians rallying alongside mortal soldiers reinvigorated Imperial morale at a moment when the galaxy teetered on collapse. Their fighting style once again displayed surgical precision, holding key nodes and command points rather than spreading across battle lines. The Mechanicus noted their restraint in weapon deployment, conserving relic-grade munitions while applying devastating force only where necessary. Across all these battles, one detail remains consistent. Custodian casualties are nearly non-existent in official records. The Administratum often omits losses entirely, while the Mechanicus refers obliquely to retrieved relics rather than fallen warriors. This lack of transparency may be intentional, preserving the myth of their invincibility. Whether this myth aligns with reality is uncertain, but the effect is undeniable. To both allies and enemies, the Custodes appear indestructible, immortal, and inexhaustible, even when logic dictates otherwise. In sum, the notable wars and battle interventions of the Adeptus Custodes cannot be studied in terms of campaigns or territory gained. They must instead be understood as fulcrum moments where their presence tipped the balance of history. The Administratum views these interventions as political necessities disguised as wars, while the Mechanicus interprets them as demonstrations of perfected warfare and technology. For both, the Custodians embody not simply soldiers, but the Emperor's direct will, manifest at the exact moment when the Imperium's survival hangs in the balance. The scattered annals of Imperial history reveal that the Adeptus Custodes have stepped onto the battlefield only at moments when the Emperor's vision appeared in danger of being eclipsed. Beyond the Siege of Terror, Vandier's Fall, and Cadia's Last Stand, there are other records, some fragmentary, some suppressed, that point to their presence in conflicts that shaped the Imperium's continuity. These episodes, often understated in administratum logs or couched in Mechanicus canticles, reinforce the Custodes' role as a decisive element summoned not for conquest but for preservation. One such record emerges from the Orphean War in the 39th millennium. The Necron awakening in that sector pushed the Astra Militarum and the Adeptus Astartes to near collapse. Amid reports of entire regiments disassembled by Gauss fire, a Custodian strike force was deployed to lead a counteroffensive against the Sotek dynasty's spearhead. The Administratum's official archive lists the Custodian presence only as auxiliary command oversight. Yet Mechanicus data stacks recovered from destroyed Necron constructs reveal weapon impacts consistent with Guardian spear discharges and Auramite resonance. On the ground, Imperial Guard survivors later described golden giants advancing through green lightning storms, their movements unbroken, their formations flawless. After the war, the Administratum recorded the victory as a costly but stabilizing success, omitting Custodian losses or numbers. The Mechanicus analysis concluded that without their intervention, Orphean defense lines would have collapsed in less than 3 months. Another lesser-known deployment occurred on Ophelia 7, a shrine world of immense symbolic weight to the ecclesiarchy. During a chaos incursion led by warbands sworn to the Prince of Excess, the world's sanctity teetered on the edge of corruption. The brides of the Emperor already present mounted a desperate defense. At the height of the crisis, Custodian envoys entered the battle not as conquerors, but as guarantors of the Emperor's dominion. They fought in silence alongside the Sisters of Battle, their Auramite reflecting cathedral light through ash-filled skies. Administratum archives later condensed this into a single sentence. Ophelia Secundus remains untainted. The Mechanicus, however, preserved sensorium data collected from orbital platforms, showing precision strikes against demon engines that defied conventional Auspex readings. To them, it was further proof of a war artistry no Forge world could replicate. The aftermath of such interventions is often as revealing as the battles themselves. The Administratum is consistent in minimizing Custodian involvement. Reports are abbreviated, phrasing is vague, and numbers are absent. This practice reflects both political caution and calculated narrative control. To overemphasize the Custodian's role would imply that the Imperium's armies alone are insufficient, undermining morale across the Guard and the Navy. To understate them entirely would risk erasing the Emperor's most sacred guardians from collective memory. Thus, the Administratum treads a narrow path, acknowledging enough to preserve reverence, but concealing enough to maintain appearances of normal governance. The result is an archive in which Custodian victories appear as anomalies, flashes of gold in oceans of grey bureaucracy. The Mechanicus' aftermath is handled differently. Within their data vaults, Custodian encounters are logged with reverent detail. Where the Administratum chooses a mission, the Mechanicus opts for mystification. Their archives preserve minute measurements of Auramite impact signatures, recoil analysis of Guardian spears, and schematics of battlefield debris that show impossibly clean cuts. Yet these records are often cloaked in ritual, couched in techno-theological language that obscures as much as it reveals. The Mechanicus does not attempt to standardize or replicate Custodian wargear openly, for such endeavors border on heresy. Instead, they enshrine these findings as living mysteries, proofs of the Omnissiah's genius embodied through the Emperor's companions. Final analysis from these two institutions diverges in emphasis but converges in conclusion. The Administratum views the Custodes as arbiters of survival. Their interventions, though rare, recalibrate the balance of imperial politics at critical moments. They end tyrannies that threaten administrative order, neutralize Xenos incursions that imperil the heart of the Imperium, and provide symbolic assurance that the Emperor's hand still guides his realm. For the scribe or the Lord Commander, their presence is both relief and terror. Relief because it signifies the Emperor's attention, terror because it bypasses every chain of command. From this perspective, the Custodes embody the principle that the Imperium is never self-governing, it is always ultimately ruled from the throne. The Mechanicus analysis is more technical and more reverent. To them, the Custodes are living manifestations of a science and artistry far beyond their grasp. Each engagement provides data to be sifted, measured, and studied, even if no practical replication is possible. They marvel at the seamless integration of weapon and wielder, the impossibility of maintaining auramite plate for millennia without degradation, and the biological resilience that allows Custodians to operate indefinitely without failure. Politically, they recognize Custodian oversight as a limit on their own autonomy. The Omnissiah's servants may forge, innovate, and adapt, but they cannot claim supremacy while the Emperor's chosen warriors continue to demonstrate a higher form of craft. Both perspectives ultimately agree on one point. The Adeptus Custodes do not fight wars in the way mortals or even Astartes understand them. They intervene at thresholds, points where survival is uncertain, where politics collapse into crisis, where faith or order teeters on destruction. Their wars are not campaigns but corrections, surgical applications of absolute force that reset the balance of imperial history. The aftermath is always the same. The Imperium endures, though records may distort the truth, and the Golden Guardians return to their vigil upon terror. Both perspectives ultimately agree on one point. The Adeptus Custodes do not fight wars in the way mortals or even Astartes understand them. They intervene at thresholds, points where survival is uncertain, where politics collapse into crisis, where faith or order teeters on destruction. Their wars are not campaigns but corrections, surgical applications of absolute force that reset the balance of imperial history. The aftermath is always the same. The Imperium endures, though records may distort the truth, and the Golden Guardians return to their vigil upon terror. The relationship between the Adeptus Custodes and the Inquisition has always been defined less by cooperation and more by controlled distance, and in that distance the Custodes hold the dominant hand. To the wider Imperium, the Inquisition presents itself as an all-reaching arm of the Emperor's will, one that transcends the bounds of mortal law and answers to none save the throne itself. In theory, this supremacy places its agents above planetary governors, space marines, and even high lords. Yet within the shadow of the Imperial Palace, such presumptions collapse entirely. Here, the Inquisition ceases to be sovereign. It must bend to the reality that the Adeptus Custodes, not inquisitors, not cardinals, not lords militant, are the Emperor's immediate guardians and interpreters of his protection. The Custodes allow the Inquisition no presumption of authority, only what access is granted at their discretion. The Inquisition's internal records show this tension clearly. Agents of the Ordos who have worked in or around the palace frequently note a sense of being tolerated rather than welcomed. Invitations into the palace proper are exceedingly rare, and when granted are tightly restricted in scope. Even the most senior lords of the Inquisition, with centuries of service and unmatched political weight, cannot set foot within the Sanctum Imperialis without Custodian approval. To attempt otherwise would be unthinkable, an act not of trespass but of treason. The Custodes themselves do not appear to consider this a negotiation or a point of rivalry. Their authority here is absolute, born not from imperial decree but from proximity to the Emperor and the fact that they have defended his person since the dawn of the Imperium. For the Inquisition, this restriction creates an unusual inversion. Outside Terra, Inquisitors act as ultimate arbiters. Within Terra, they are placed into the same position as any other imperial servant, subject to Custodian oversight, stripped of their presumed extraterritorial rights. Reports preserved in Ordo Hereticus archives describe the Custodes as unfailingly polite, but unmistakably cold when addressing Inquisitors, as if regarding them as children playing with forces they cannot hope to control. This tone is not the personal disdain of one faction toward another, but a consequence of the Custodes' worldview. For them, Inquisitors are transient mortals entrusted with temporary authority. The Custodes themselves are eternal. They were present before the Inquisition existed and will endure after its institutions crumble. There have been moments of cooperation, though these are almost always transactional. Inquisitors may request custodian testimony, records, or advice when investigating matters of imperial governance or warp phenomena that threaten terror directly. In such cases, the Custodes provide assistance not because the Inquisition demands it, but because they have judged the matter to intersect with the Emperor's security. Instances of Custodes accompanying Inquisitors beyond terror are virtually non-existent, though there are apocryphal accounts of golden-armoured figures aiding in the purging of cults, whose influence had reached dangerously close to the throne world. If such interventions occurred, they were not at inquisitorial request but the Custodes' own initiative, with the Inquisitor reduced to an observer rather than a commander. The Inquisition has never openly challenged the Custodes' supremacy over the palace. Such a conflict would be futile. Even the Order Malleus, steeped in demonology and empowered with authority to command Grey Knights, cannot force entry into the sanctum. The Adeptus Custodes do not recognize inquisitorial seals or rosettes as meaningful tokens of access. In Custodian eyes, these are emblems of bureaucratic hierarchy, not divine sanction. Their refusal is absolute yet delivered without aggression. They do not need to declare jurisdiction. Their presence alone enforces it. It is telling that when Inquisitors speak of the Adeptus Custodes in their private commentaries, there is an undercurrent of unease. Not fear precisely, though many confess to awe at their scale, presence and silent confidence, but recognition that here stands a power immune to their usual methods. The Inquisition wields intimidation, coercion, and political leverage across the galaxy. Against the Custodes, these tools are null, threats mean nothing, persuasion even less, and even the highest political maneuverings crumble in the face of a warrior who can strike down space marines with ease, and who has centuries of first-hand memory of Imperial history. Some Inquisitors describe speaking with a Custodian as speaking with living stone, immovable, incorruptible, and utterly disinterested in the subtle machinations of human politics. This friction extends to philosophical outlook. The Inquisition is, at its core, reactive. Its agents scour the Imperium for corruption, heresy, and Xenos influence, and in response they deploy the Emperor's justice as they interpret it. The Custodes, however, are proactive in a manner far more absolute. They do not concern themselves with rooting out planetary cults or purging alien taint in the galactic frontier. Their vigilance is directed inward, toward terror, toward the safety of the Emperor himself. Inquisitors have criticized this as narrow-minded, accusing the Custodes of neglecting the wider Imperium by focusing so entirely on the palace. Yet the Custodes do not see this as neglect, but fidelity to their singular purpose. They were created to be guardians, not crusaders. From their perspective, Inquisitors expend themselves in 1,000 directions, while the Custodes preserve the one defense that matters above all others. When Inquisitors are permitted within the palace, they often remark on the oppressive silence that dominates its corridors. Surrounded by the golden-armoured sentinels, the most powerful interrogators and orators find themselves uncharacteristically muted. There are stories of Inquisitors attempting to assert themselves, only to be met with a single glance from a Custodian helm, an unblinking stare that reduces even the most seasoned witch hunters to silence. Such moments are not threats, but they convey the truth more clearly than words. In this place, Inquisitors are guests under constant scrutiny. The politics of the High Lords further complicate matters. The Inquisition holds seats of influence within the Senatorum Imperialis, but even there, Custodian presence is a reminder that ultimate power rests not with councils or decrees, but with the guardians of the throne. The Custodes themselves rarely if ever intervene in the Senate's debates. Their mere silence within its halls exerts more pressure than words could. For Inquisitors who pride themselves on manipulating politics to achieve their goals, the Custodes' refusal to play such games is a source of deep frustration. There are, of course, Inquisitors who revere the Custodes, seeing them as living proof of the Emperor's design. These agents frame the Custodes as the ideal of what humanity could be, if elevated beyond frailty and corruption. Yet even in reverence, there is distance. No inquisitor mistakes the Custodes for allies. They are guardians, not partners. At best, they may be admired. At worst, they are seen as obstacles to inquisitorial independence. The most cynical inquisitors whisper that the Custodes embody a problem for the Inquisition. Here is an order immune to oversight, unreachable by politics and uninterested in compromise. They cannot be threatened, corrupted, or commanded, and for a body like the Inquisition, whose power rests on the ability to bend others to its will, this immunity borders on intolerable. Despite such tensions, outright conflict between the Inquisition and the Custodes has never erupted. The reason is simple. Both factions, despite their differences, acknowledge the centrality of the Emperor. For the Inquisition, he is the justification of all actions, no matter how ruthless. For the Custodes, he is not justification but presence, the one truth they protect. This shared axis prevents ideological schism. It also ensures that, however much the Inquisition may bristle at custodian restrictions, it will never cross the line into hostility. The cost would be annihilation. It is worth noting that the Inquisition itself, for all its claims to omniscience, maintains few records on the Custodes' internal affairs. Their organisation, numbers and rituals remain opaque even to the most well-connected interrogators. Attempts to probe deeper are rebuffed. Custodes are not deceived by inquisitorial questioning. They answer only what they choose, and often in ways that seem designed to emphasize inquisitorial ignorance. For an institution that survives by uncovering secrets, this denial is a rare and humbling experience. In the end, the impressions of the Inquisition can be summarized in a paradox. They see the Custodes as both subordinate to the Emperor's will and yet superior to any worldly authority, including their own. The Custodes are guardians of a single man, yet in protecting him, they overshadow the entire Imperium's hierarchy. To the Inquisition, this is a reminder that its power, however immense across the stars, finds its limit on the steps of the Golden Throne. When the Inquisition turns its scrutiny toward the Adeptus Custodes, the first barrier it meets is absence, not the absence of activity, but the absence of records. Unlike the Imperial Guard, whose deployments are meticulously logged by the Administratum, or the Adeptus Astartes, whose campaigns are recorded in chapter annals, the Custodes leave behind few formal documents accessible to outsiders. Their battles, when acknowledged at all, are cloaked in summary, omission, or ambiguity. To inquisitors accustomed to tracing every engagement in exhaustive detail, this void is disquieting. It raises the possibility that the Custodes have fought more wars than are publicly known, and that these wars may carry implications the Imperium itself has been shielded from. The most prominent anomaly lies in the Siege of Terror. During that final confrontation of the Horus Heresy, the Custodes fought at the forefront of the palace's defences. Inquisitorial records compiled long after the event attempt to reconstruct the Custodes' role, yet these accounts are fractured. The Custodes' own testimony remains partial, perhaps deliberately so. Reports preserved within the Ordo Malleus archives note discrepancies between Custodian accounts and Mechanicum Remembrancer records. For example, in the Saturnine Gate's defense, some Mechanicus data scribes logged Custodian units striking from positions where no Imperial deployments had been scheduled. These sudden insertions suggest movements unrecorded by conventional command channels, as if the Custodes operated on their own timeline, independent even of Dawn's coordination. To Inquisitors, this discrepancy highlights an enduring truth. The Custodes do not fight as part of an army. They fight as instruments of their own design, answering to no chain of command except their own judgment and the throne. Subsequent anomalies arise during the Scouring. Several inquisitorial fragments refer to Custodian interventions against remnants of traitor forces fleeing Terror. Yet these interventions are not universally acknowledged. In some cases, battle sites appear scrubbed from administratum maps, with only oral testimony from survivors hinting at golden warriors who struck without banners or heraldry, then departed without recognition. Inquisitors investigating such claims find themselves hampered by Custodian silence. requests for confirmation are met with carefully chosen words, neither outright denial nor admission, but a kind of rhetorical redirection. What matters is that the threat no longer exists. The Age of Apostasy offers another layer of uncertainty. While the ecclesiarchy spiraled into corruption and the Imperium burned with civil strife, the Custodes remained within the palace. At least, so the official histories state. Yet inquisitorial agents scouring sealed Mechanicus data vaults claim to have uncovered references to Custodian presence in theatres far removed from Terra. One fragment describes Custodians striking against an ecclesiarchal fleet whose zeal threatened the throne world supply chains. Another notes Custodian intervention in the purge of a rogue navigator's enclave. If genuine, these would constitute direct Custodian deployment beyond Terra at a time when official doctrine insists they were immobile. Whether these anomalies represent factual operations or the embellishments of terrified witnesses remains unresolved, but the Inquisition notes the persistence of such reports with unease. Modern records provide their own contradictions. During the 13th Black Crusade, the Adeptus Custodes are acknowledged to have left the palace for the first time in millennia, accompanying the Indomitus Crusade under Guilliman's leadership. Yet inquisitorial cross-examinations reveal indications of earlier undocumented departures. Sealed Ordo Xenos files describe encounters with Golden Warriors on fringe worlds, centuries before Guilliman's return. The classification markings on these files suggest they were not intended for public record. One document recounts an Ordo Xenos kill team arriving on an agri-world overrun by tyrannid vanguard organisms, only to find the infestation already eradicated. Survivors spoke of towering figures who moved with surgical precision, annihilating the swarm in a matter of hours. No banners were raised, no records left, and the Custodians never acknowledged their involvement. Other sealed reports dwell on anomalies of scale. Custodes are few in number. By most estimates, no more than 10,000 exist at any time. Yet battle testimonies sometimes describe engagements where their presence seems mathematically inconsistent. Inquisitors examining war zones such as the Cataclysm of Nova Thulium report that eyewitnesses claim to see entire companies of Golden Warriors, far exceeding known Custodian strength. Either witnesses confused them with Astartes, or the Custodes possess undisclosed reserves. Inquisitors have debated whether such accounts represent psycho-distorted perceptions or intentional manipulation of memory by the Custodes themselves. Whatever the truth, the numbers never resolve neatly. Equally troubling are reports of Custodian combat methods that defy standard record. Administratum logs describe engagements where Custodes struck at enemies who had not yet arrived, as if anticipating movements before they occurred. While this may be attributed to their advanced genecraft and training, Inquisitors note the possibility of deeper mechanisms, precognitive tactics, or the influence of technologies unknown even to the Mechanicus. A sealed Ordo Malleus dossier cites an instance during the defense of a Titan Manufactorum, where Custodes eliminated a Chaos warband hours before their warp incursion became detectable. How they perceived the threat remains unexplained, and the Custodes declined to provide clarification. The report concludes with the understated remark, "Their knowledge exceeds our own, caution advised." Anomalies extend into battle aftermaths as well. Inquisitors cataloguing war zones with Custodian involvement often encounter unexplained purges of data, missing corpses, or altered landscapes. In one case, following a Custodian strike against a renegade Mechanicum forge, the planet's surface was discovered vitrified across a 50-kilometer radius. No Imperial weapons are known to produce such an effect at such scale, yet no Custodian war engine was recorded in the field. The Mechanicus was denied further investigation, and Custodian representatives issued the terse directive, "The site is secure, do not return." The sealed reports that trouble Inquisitors most are those concerning Custodian contact with the warp. Though the Custodes are not a psychic order in the sense of the Librarius, their proximity to the Emperor and their unique training places them in a category apart. Several Ordo Malleus records describe instances where Custodes appear to resist or negate warp phenomena with an ease rivaling that of Grey Knights. Inquisitors present at these encounters describe a palpable aegis, an aura that renders demonic manifestations unstable. This has prompted debate within the Inquisition. Do the Custodes carry hidden psychic enhancements, or is their link to the Emperor so direct that his presence shields them? The Custodes, when questioned, provide no answers, offering only silence. Such mysteries have produced a culture of speculation within the Inquisition. The Order Hereticus worries that Custodian secrecy conceals methods beyond doctrinal approval. The Order Xenos theorizes that their technology may border on Xenotech in sophistication, though none dare accuse them openly. The Order Malleus, by contrast, tends toward reverence, treating Custodian anomalies as proof of divine sanction. All factions, however, share one conclusion. The Custodes do not fight wars as others do. They strike in ways that bend chronology, defy logistics, and erase evidence. What remains are impressions, fragments, and silence. The sealed reports that survive are not invitations to knowledge but warnings. They remind Inquisitors of the Custodes' autonomy and the futility of pressing too hard against their secrecy. To enter the palace without permission is forbidden. To pry too deeply risks provoking guardians who have withstood the greatest treacheries of mankind. And so, even the Inquisition, the body that claims absolute authority to uncover all heresies, files its reports in locked archives, stamped not with conclusions but with cautions. The impression left by these anomalies is one of deliberate opacity. The Custodes do not seek recognition for their wars, nor do they allow themselves to be catalogued. They exist outside the metrics of battle reports and casualty counts. Where they intervene, they leave behind not records but absence, not testimony but erasure. Inquisitors, for all their power, can only stand at the edges of these silences, noting the shadows of events they are forbidden to truly see. The most guarded archives of the Inquisition contain files labelled not only restricted but inaccessible without High Conclave sanction. These are the documents that deal directly with the Adeptus Custodes. Their classification marks exceed even those reserved for the most sensitive Exterminator's orders or forbidden Xenos studies. Within their encrypted folios, fragments of testimony, recovered data logs, and redacted battle observations attempt to give form to what is otherwise a deliberate silence. One of the most frequently cited files in Ordo Heretica's vaults is simply titled Contact, Palace Authority. It is not a detailed dossier, but rather a series of incident reports compiled by Inquisitors who were invited to the Imperial Palace under extraordinary circumstances. Each record follows the same structure. The invitation arrived without prior request, issued under Custodian seal. The Inquisitor entered the palace escorted at all times by Custodian guardians. No unsupervised access to corridors, archives, or chambers was permitted. The audience itself was conducted in solemn silence, with the Custodian speaking only when absolutely necessary. These testimonies reveal a common impression. The Custodes treat the Inquisition not as equals, but as tolerated guests, admitted only when the Emperor's companions deem it relevant. The files contain no mention of Inquisitors ever crossing into the innermost sanctum where the Emperor rests. For all their authority, Inquisitors remain at the threshold, not within. Another sealed file housed within the Ordo Xenos crypts carries the designation Anomalous Presence Reports. This collection catalogues battlefield encounters where Custodian involvement was suspected but never confirmed by the Administratum. The file notes their appearance on distant fringe worlds, sometimes months before Imperial reconnaissance registered a threat. It highlights inconsistencies in warp route calculations that suggest the Custodes traversed paths inaccessible to conventional fleets. Marginal annotations in inquisitorial script speculate on the possibility of secretive propulsion systems, alternative webway usage, or other technologies lost to the rest of mankind. Yet all such entries are heavily redacted, with entire pages reduced to black bars. Where Inquisitors pressed for clarity, Custodian responses were minimal. The Emperor commands, that is sufficient. The Ordo Malleus maintains its own most guarded documents concerning the Custodes, often tied to demonological threats. In a file labelled Golden Intercessions, the Inquisition records encounters in which demonic incursions were abruptly neutralised without Grey Knight deployment. The documents describe war zones where reality itself appeared stabilised in the presence of Custodian detachments. Witnesses recount phenomena such as warp storms dissipating, demonic forms collapsing into ash upon contact with Auramite, and sorcerous rituals unravelling before completion. The Order Malleus, unlike the Hereticus or Xenos branches, tends toward reverence in its conclusions. Its annotations suggest that the Custodes are not merely warriors, but conduits of the Emperor's authority, a human aegis whose presence repels the immaterial. This interpretation is not universal, but it persists as a thread of near-theological belief within inquisitorial circles. Beyond these thematic files, there are documents so tightly restricted that their very existence is uncertain. Rumours persist of an Aegis dossier compiled by a conclave of inquisitors who studied Custodian deployments over 10 millennia. The file is said to contain an assessment of their total numbers, their hidden reserves, and their methods of replenishment. Whether such a dossier truly exists or is the invention of overzealous scribes remains unproven. What is known is that no inquisitor has ever declared such findings publicly, for fear of breaching the carefully maintained boundary between custodian secrecy and inquisitorial curiosity. Final thoughts from within the Inquisition reflect this tension. The Custodes represent both reassurance and disquiet. They are reassurance because their presence signifies that the Emperor is still defended by his most faithful and capable warriors. They are disquiet because their secrecy is absolute, their power beyond question, and their accountability non-existent. In a galaxy where every institution is subject to suspicion and purge, the Custodes remain uniquely untouchable. The Inquisition can demand answers from Space Marine chapters, from planetary governors, even from the High Lords of Terror. But when their inquiries turn toward the Custodes, the usual tools of coercion fall silent. The Emperor's companions cannot be summoned, interrogated, or compelled. They may only be observed when they choose to appear, and even then their words are limited to necessity. Inquisitorial conclaves debate the meaning of this limitation. Some argue that it is appropriate, that the Custodes are beyond mortal reproach and must remain inviolate to preserve the Emperor's sanctity. Others express concern that no power in the Imperium should exist without oversight, for history shows that even the most loyal can fall. Yet even those who harbour suspicion temper their words with caution. To challenge the Custodes directly is to invite silence at best, eradication at worst. No inquisitor dares such provocation, for they know that the Custodes answer only to the Emperor, not to any mortal authority. Thus, the Inquisition's final perspective is paradoxical. The Custodes are acknowledged as guardians who ensure the survival of Terra and, by extension, the Imperium itself. Their existence affirms that humanity's master is still shielded by living blades, but their secrecy ensures that even the most powerful investigative body in the Imperium remains on the outside, piecing together fragments, anomalies, and rumours without ever achieving full clarity. The classified files that survive within inquisitorial vaults serve less as chronicles and more as reminders. They remind each generation of inquisitors that there are boundaries even they cannot cross. They remind them that the Custodes are not peers, allies, or tools, but a presence beyond interrogation. And they remind them that the Emperor's will, embodied in Golden Guardians, is not subject to human scrutiny. In the end, the Inquisition records its conclusions with the restraint demanded of those who know they are under observation themselves. The final words of a heretic's report encapsulate this unease. We do not watch the Custodes, they watch us.